There was a young man that was killed in Detroit, and there's people actually protesting on the street right now.
SubhanAllah.
This just happened?
It happened about 4 hours ago.
Assalamu alaikum. We're gonna get started now, inshallah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, thank you for joining us for another healing discussion in race. On race. Today's subject is being leaders of justice. Joining us are our esteemed panelists, Imam Dawud Walid from Care, Michigan, and Sheikha Zainab Ansari from Taysir Seminary in Knoxville, Tennessee. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, panelists. How are you doing today?
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you doing? Thank you for inviting us.
Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum, Imam Dawud.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Let's get straight to it today. Just a brief overview on the journey we've taken with these discussions. Obviously, all of this started shortly after the brutal murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And we wanted to take our community on a series of healing discussions. We just had a session that talked about just, let's talk and understand the current events and the history behind these events that continue to repeat themselves in light of a police state and police brutality and the systems of white supremacy and racial injustices in this country. And then we had another discussion more recently on towards building a prophetic community, namely our masajid, and making sure that they are spiritual lampposts for everyone, with a focus on the emphasis of the African American community. We also alluded to other communities, other members in our community that are unfortunately disenfranchised due to perhaps our own shortcomings. And today's discussion will focus on being leaders of justice. Just a brief abstract: enjoining good and forbidding evil is not just lip service. Firm belief manifests through the limbs and brings benefit to the broader society, both to Muslims and those of other faiths. This session will offer an exposition on our duty for being leaders of justice to our community. Specifically, our listeners, you will be challenged to contemplate the societal struggles relevant to the Capital District. And if you're tuning in from somewhere else, contemplate the societal struggles in your own districts, in your own communities, and see how we can use our faith to lead the way in addressing these struggles. What spiritual fortitude will be required to take on such projects, and what tangible instructions can we benefit from our beautiful teachers this evening so that we can be healers to the society. Joining us, as we said, are both Imam Dawud and Sheikha Zainab Ansari. I wanted to introduce them briefly. Sheikha Zainab Ansari has served the Muslim community of Knoxville since 2014 as a scholar in residence, a public speaker, facilitator of interfaith dialogue, a youth mentor, and a full-time instructor of Taysir Seminary. She has over 10 years of experience as a student and teacher of traditional Islam in various settings, and she spent her formative years in Damascus, Syria. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease the struggle of the Syrian people and all those who are struggling everywhere in the world. She's done her formative studies in Syria in the classic sciences, and prior to settling in Knoxville, she was based in Atlanta, Georgia, where she earned degrees in world history and Middle Eastern studies at Georgia State University. Ustad Zainab travels through the United States speaking on issues of concern to the North American Muslim community at various forums, including Alim, Mass Ikna, and Isna, and she contributes to multiple online Islamic portals and has published several articles on Sunni Path, Seekers Guidance, and other platforms. She's also on the board of directors and a teaching faculty on the Rabat program, an online Islamic studies program led by Dr. Tamara Gray, a leading woman scholar in traditional Islam. Also, we have Imam Dawud Walid. Imam Dawud is currently serving as the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on Islamic of the Council on American Islamic Relations, Care, Michigan, which is the chapter of America's largest advocacy and civil liberties organization for American Muslims. And he's also a member of the Michigan Muslim Council, Community Council, Imams Committee. Imam Dawud has been interviewed and quoted in approximately 150 media outlets, ranging from the New York Times to Al Jazeera, and he's lectured at over 50 universities. He's done his classical studies in Islamic theology, Arabic grammar and morphology, foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, and science of exegesis in the Quran, and Sirah. He's previously served as an imam at Masjid Wali Muhammad in Detroit, Michigan, and the Bosnian American Society in Michigan. He's authored multiple books, and I feel his books, his publications are growing more important with every day that passes. One of his titles is Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims, and he's more recently published Towards Sacred Activism, whose content will feature heavily in today's discussion and is truly a must-read for those that want to bring about change in a way that is pleasing to our Creator. Once again, assalamu alaikum to the panelists, and let's get started with our first question. Imam Dawud and Ustad Zainab, can you share with us, maybe starting with Imam Dawud, can you share with us, as folks who work in the field of da'wah and teach, what you see as being some of the key strengths, as well as some of the underlying areas of struggle in the Black American community?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق وخاتم لما سبق الناصر بالحق بالحق وهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. First of all, let me say to Brother Ahmed and the Al-Hidaya community, as well as Sheikh Jafar, may Allah reward you all for this programming and the previous programming that you've had in regards to this very timely subject, and may Allah Azza wa Jal preserve your community. And I pray to Allah Azza wa Jal that once COVID-19 it lifts or there's a vaccine, that I'm able to come back to your community and visit again. I had a good time there, along with Sheikh Arsalan the last time that I was there. I'm glad that we started off with the strength. And in regards to the African American Muslim community in particular, I say that one strength of our community, and especially when it comes to those who are converts to convert to Islam, is the level of love, and we can even say healthy zeal for embracing Islam in its totality. So first, with openly being Muslim. You know, I can think back to the late 80s and early 90s, way before 9/11, and being a young man in Richmond, Virginia. I remember that it was actually cool to be Muslim back then. When I was in high school and then starting undergrad, actually it was cool. And the amount of izzah and respect that was commanded from the Muslims, and the amount of pride that people had. And I know, and I've been told many times from primarily brothers that immigrated to America at a certain particular time in the latter 60s going into the 70s, that they were a little cautious about openly being Muslim, at least in Richmond, as well as when I lived in New York. And it was the strength that they saw exhibited by African American Muslims to change their names, or change our names from anglicized names, not being scared of being called Muhammad, not being scared of wearing hijab, not being scared of wearing a kufi, or as our Urdu speakers say, topi, and to be openly in the streets, actually giving dawah. Right, this is something that is a legacy that African American Muslims have carried, and it goes back to the days even before Malcolm X with the Universal Islamic Society here in Detroit, that started back in the 20s, before the Nation of Islam, with the Dar al-Islam movement that we call the DAR, the Islamic Party. And until even today, the amount of zeal and love that a lot of the brothers and sisters openly show for the Deen of Allah Azza wa Jal. And I can't and I'm stressing this because this may seem like a tangible, something that's not very tangible, but this level of himma that is shown in openly being Muslim, only Allah knows how many people who've been scared or weary about openly exhibiting their Islamic identity, who are not Black, have actually benefited from those truly unapologetic Muslims who are Black that go back to my father's generation and before, who've carried the flag of Islam here in America.
Barakallah feek. That's a very powerful opening. Sheikh Zainab, would you like to add?
Yes. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa afdal as-salah wa atammu at-taslim ala Sayyid al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Again, assalamu alaikum, and I'm glad to join tonight's conversation. And I've not had a chance to actually visit New York or even upstate New York, so I hope, inshallah, to remedy that in the near future. But it's nice to be able to join everybody virtually, and I want to thank Brother Ahmed and the organizers for convening this conversation. And I think it's really, this is a very good point, I think, to help us kind of frame our discussion here, because we want to make sure that we approach this issue with a certain level of balance. I actually teach classes on the history of Islam in America at Taysir Seminary. And one of the very interesting observations from our students taking this class, whatever their background is, whether they are transnational or whether they are converts to Islam or indigenous, is that it's really impossible to fully teach a history of Islam in America with all of its richness without really centering the African American Muslim experience. And even when you're reading about the history of Islam and Muslims in this country during, say, the antebellum period, during the period of slavery, again, the resilience, the courage, the strength, the grace of the African American community and the Muslim community is really just it's something that's really evident to my students, and it's something they remark upon. And as Imam Dawud said, may Allah Ta'ala preserve him and his family, it's these conversion stories that really, I think, help all of us, whatever our background is, in terms of were we so-called born Muslim or whatever our journeys are. It's really through these conversion stories that we have an opportunity to actually see Islam through the eyes of someone that is really embracing Islam and all of its kind of redemptive possibilities. And my own parents' journey really exemplifies that. My mother is African American, my dad is Arab American, and they both converted to Islam in the 1970s. And it was really after looking, for example, at Malcolm X and his autobiography, and just really from their interactions with Muslims, many of whom were African American, there was this sense of udkhulu fi silmi kaffa, enter into Islam wholeheartedly, that really appealed to them. And I think this is one of the great strengths of the community, this sense of the sincerity and the sense of ardor with which they embrace Islam.
Thank you for those opening comments. I can definitely echo that. I mean, I've visited Atlanta multiple times, which has one of the, I think, richest Black American Muslim community. And I can say when I prayed in Atlanta Masjid, myself and my brother were maybe we were the only two people who were not African American in that masjid. And I felt more at home there in my first time than a lot of masajid that I've frequented more often, for sure. And that's definitely a huge plus to the community, and something we can definitely and we should learn from. The reality is, unfortunately, with those strengths, there are some areas of that every community needs to see improvement, and a lot of it is due to the system of oppression around the Black American community. So Imam Dawud, you're really on the ground and you do a lot of social justice work. What are some of the areas of struggle in the Black American community? If you can share that with us.
Well, if I can reach back to our American Shaheed, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, rahmatullahi alayh, and actually our beloved Sheikh Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, Hafidhullah, referred to Brother Malcolm as the Imam Hussein of America. That Brother Malcolm, Minister Malcolm, he said that though Islam had solved his individual issue on a personal level, it had not solved the problem or the issue or the problem of the African American people had not been solved. And he even made reference to this, that why he would continue using the name Malcolm X. And I think that this is part of the challenge for us as African American Muslims, especially those of us who come from Muslim parents or grew up in the deen. But even those maybe who've been around for maybe 20, 30 years or so, is that though many of us have found a sense of personal wellness and wholeness as being Muslims and having an attachment to our Islamic centers, and also have children and grandchildren, some even great grandchildren, right? Like my children are fourth generation African American Muslims, right? We still face some of the exact same issues that plague the Black community, and just being Muslim didn't solve that for us. Some of us are highly educated, and maybe we live in zip codes that aren't aggressively policed. And then some of us are also living in some of these exact same zip codes in which there's the militarization of the police, in which there are underfunded schooling that has taken place, and which leads to what we call the school to prison pipeline. And Muslims are part and parcel of living in these neighborhoods that are at risk, where there's redlining going on, and et cetera. I mean, prime example, there was a young Black man who was killed today in Detroit on the west side, not too far away from where my ex-wife lives at. And my children are there right now, and I called and told them to stay in the house. But this man was killed, and then people have now gone to the streets to protest, and it's becoming very tense between the police and the residents, where there's Muslims that also live in that neighborhood. So a close friend of mine, we're on a WhatsApp group with some people. He's supposed to have been going and picking up his niece from there. And he's like worried about even going up to pick up his Muslim niece because of the convergence of police in that area, what that could mean to him as a dark complected African American male who's in his 30s going into that area. Like it's so that's just one issue, and there's much more that could be said, but I would pass it on to Ustad Zainab.
Thank you, Imam Dawud. And Brother Ahmed, if you could just, if you don't mind, just remind me of the question again, just to make sure that I respond.
So yeah, the question was, we talked about some of the key strengths in the Black American community. Having lived, perhaps you're in a suburban community now in Knoxville, but prior to that you were in Atlanta, which has a vibrant African American community. What are some of the areas of struggle within the Black American community?
So, some of the areas that I would identify, again, as someone who teaches the history of Islam in this country, is that I think Imam Dawud, being involved in activist circles on the ground, is much better positioned to speak to some of those issues as they're kind of unfolding in communities. But I think what I can speak to, perhaps from my standpoint as an educator, is sort of what I view as sort of an erasure of the African American voice and narrative. That's something that I've actually observed, and how that erasure of voice and presence and narrative, it often goes hand in hand with other processes that we are witnessing, whether these are macro historical processes or micro historical processes. One of the many strengths I think of the African American community and Muslim community in Atlanta is that, historically Atlanta has been home to a very vibrant African American middle class. But one of the things that I've sort of observed, moving from, Atlanta to Knoxville is that, alhamdulillah, our community is by and large a suburban community, and there is definitely a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood and a lot of support coming from many quarters of the community, but there are very real hurdles in terms of lack of access to resources, to education, to housing in certain areas, to education, to healthcare. So I think when you bring these things together, right, these structural problems and impediments, and you put these things together with, again, what I'm kind of experiencing as kind of an erasure of the narrative. For me, that's the challenge, because the challenge is not just sort of in the sense of lack of access to resources or practical considerations and obstacles, but when there's a sense of not having a voice. So for me, the focus has really been on trying to sort of center those voices and to educate different segments of our community, to really educate our community around these issues of let's validate, let's listen to these voices, let's sit down and listen and learn.
Yeah. So I mean, as Sheikh Zainab was sharing those thoughts, Imam Dawood's book Centering Black Narrative kept coming to mind, and that's actually a book which reminds us of some of the pious predecessors who were of a darker complexion in our seerah and would, in present day terms, be considered black. Going forward in our discussion, there's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of people that want to do positive work. Imam Dawood, what I wanted to ask is, how involved are Muslims in community justice work, and what pockets of the Muslim community are really involved? And are there some pockets, for example, the immigrant American Muslim community, that really needs to perhaps respond to the call a little bit more?
Well, I would divide this into three different groups. You have one group of people who is a small group of people who are basically they do activism as a living. So they work for a nonprofit organization, be it a Muslim-led or an Islamic-based organization, or or doing work in a non-Muslim or non-Islamic space per se, but are doing activism and relating to what some would dub as social justice issues. This is a very small percentage of the Muslim community, right? This wouldn't even be a tenth of a percent of 7 million American Muslims. Then you have another group of people who are engaged and who volunteer and do various things within the Muslim community on a volunteer level, and contribute where they can, and including volunteering for some of these organizations. And but they also have full-time gigs or full-time jobs. Then you have another group of people in the community who probably aren't that active at all and volunteering much less. But there's a percentage of them who may give financial contributions towards some sort of social justice cause. So that's how I split those things up. From my perspective, I don't think that every single person has to be pumping their fist at a protest. Everyone doesn't have to march. There's different lanes or different avenues that people can be involved in highlighting the issues of trying to bring about a more just society. This could be done through spoken word and the arts, of helping to highlight. This could be through education. This could be through giving money. I mean, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, for instance, a Sahabi, he wasn't the most adept with the sword, but he gave a lot of donations, right, for fi sabilillah, for the sake of Islam. Then you have some people also who are on the front lines. I think that a major impediment of why Muslims have not been more active in certain causes, I think, are two things. And I'm putting, inshallah, I'm having husnul dhan, I'm putting the best construction on this. So one, I think that many people simply are unaware and not only about the depth of the injustices systemically or structurally in America because of not fully understanding or having a strong grasp on American history. I think that's an impediment which can be improved on, which would maybe cause certain people to say, well, maybe things really aren't that bad, or it's not happening to me or my group. Why can't these people lift themselves up by their bootstraps? It could express itself into that relating to certain issues. And then some of it too, we have to keep it real, is that we have a level of Muslims, all communities or subsections of the Muslim community have a level of ta'assub, have a level of like tribalism, right? And sometimes people, they view justice as justice means just us, right? It means it's our issue and how we highlight certain things of what's important to us. And then it become an issue of, well, maybe these issues here aren't really major issues of injustice that I need to be concerned about, even though I'm living in America, right? So we can't, from my vantage point and being involved in the community and grassroots and doing things for at least 20 years now, I know that does exist within the American Muslim community, and I think that is an impediment for us to dealing with some of these systemic issues in America in a more holistic fashion, even to the detriment of us as a whole. I mean, historically, connecting the dots, that there is a real relationship between Islamophobia in America and anti-Black racism. Like the first Islamophobia in America was against the enslaved Africans who were Muslims, right? The otherization of Muslims as being seen as non-white people or people of color relates back to the false ideology of white supremacy that America was established upon, that marginalized Black people from day one. And there's a relationship between that and Islamophobia that I think that many people, we haven't done a good job of connecting those dots.
SubhanAllah. You brought up a couple of important major impediments. One, some with husn al-dhan being unaware of the depth of injustices in America, and that reminds me of some of the work that Sheikh Zainab is doing in terms of educating her community on history, and I think we'll get to that in more detail and later in the session. And then the other, some having tribalism, justice is just us. And what I want to remind our viewers is we will have a session which will encourage our viewers to do a deep dive on the racial inclinations and tendencies and prejudices that we do have in our own chests. And that's important if we want to be effective leaders of social change, that we need to be effective change agents of ourselves with the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another important thing you mentioned, Imam Dawud, is not every person needs to be pumping their fist at a protest. There are different lanes that people can get involved in to bring about social change. But the important underlying factor, the common denominator, is that if you want to bring about social change, it needs to be done in a way that's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot of people want to get involved these days, Imam Dawud. But as your work towards sacred activism points out, there is a certain framework, an ethical framework that we need to keep in mind and keep close to our heart. For those looking to get involved in community projects, can you give us the pulse on some of the good work that we should be aware of and some of the work that we should be very wary of? Furthermore, if we're looking to get involved in social activism, what are the key ethical requirements for engagement that you would like to underline?
Bismillah, Ustad Zainab.
Right. Thank you, Imam Dawud. I appreciate that. And Brother Ahmed, it's not Sheikh Zainab, but I do appreciate that. Thank you for the conferral of that credential. Alhamdulillah. There's, Imam Dawud honestly wrote the book on this subject, and I've read his book. It's excellent. I think that, again, in working with youth, there's a lot of enthusiasm and zeal and kind of let's go out and change the world. And sometimes I think that, I'm sensing that there can be a certain level of frustration in that young people really want to go out there and do something and affect change. And they're finding that sort of the circles where these issues they care about are being addressed tend to be very liberal or very progressive circles. So inevitably there arises this question, for young Muslims and those who are young at heart, to what extent can we sort of align or ally ourselves with groups that might place emphasis on values or a lifestyle approach that's not in consonance with Islamic values. This is a very important question. I would really recommend that everyone who's involved in Islamic activism, that we need to be very well educated. We need to be very aware of these issues. Read Imam Dawud's book. I'm very happy to make a plug for that book. And also have some recourse to a teacher, right? To some modes of Islamic tarbiyah, and understand there is actually a prophetic model for how to work and build community and how to affect change. I know, Brother Ahmed, part of the question was what should we be doing, what to kind of steer clear of, and I don't know that I can give any hard and fast answers, but my main piece of nasiha to the audience out there, especially younger people, would be that as much as sort of appealing as it is to make common cause with very liberal or very progressive groups, and I understand that, as Muslims, you might find a lot of support with those groups, that there is going to be an inevitable kind of diluting of who you are as a Muslim, and be very careful about that, because it can happen kind of a little sort of very gradually to where you don't even notice that, to where sometimes you even your own kind of core principles and values as a Muslim become a bit obsolete. Dr. Sherman Jackson has spoken about this, to where there is a particular kind of universe of values that we have as Muslims, and that is becoming increasingly obsolete in some circles. So I think for young people, we just need to make sure that we're self-aware, and that we also understand, that when we become involved in activism, that's why I actually have my students read certain books, that we have to understand that, when you're looking at issues of social justice and change, from a certain standpoint, which is usually associated with views that are more liberal or more leftist, that there's a very materialistic way sometimes of kind of looking at the world and the relationship of cause and effect, and where sometimes some activists view the ends and the means being strictly confined to this dunya. As Muslims, that we view it entirely differently, and we must never lose sight of that. And Imam Dawud needs to address this. So thank you.
Thank you, Ustadha Zainab. What I would say is, and I would just deal more with the first part of the question, but I think it's very important for us to point towards certain organizations and certain groups that are modeling what I think is something prophetic. Though all organizations can tighten up and do better, obviously, but one is the Inner City Muslim Action Network, known as Iman. It started in Southside Chicago by our beloved Palestinian brother, Dr. Rami Nashashibi, who also teaches at the Chicago Seminary. And then they opened up an office in Atlanta. So Iman Atlanta, ran by our brother Imam Mansour Sabri. So this is one organization that has been doing direct services as well as organizing around some of these issues as relating to police accountability and things like this, but also being interrupters of conflict within inside of the community, right? And this is one thing I have to say. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings that many people have who aren't Black, is that they think that all Black people do is protest when the police kill Black people, but we don't say anything about the actual crime that takes place in Black communities when Black people who are civilians commit violence against other Black civilians. That is completely a myth. There are always people been on the ground working to de-escalate conflict. There have been gun buyback programs. There literally have been protests inside the streets calling for peace between gangs. And this has always taken place. I mean, Imam Siraj's claim to fame in Bed-Stuy is actually cleaning up, not only cleaning up the drugs that were being sold in Bed-Stuy, which then later caused for the property levels to go up, but actually gave dawah to the drug dealers, and some of the drug dealers put down the drugs and took their shahaadatain, right? They declared Islam, and they've been upright, productive citizens. So I just had to make that point. So Iman is one organization. The other one I would say is our brother Imam Jihad Safir in South Central LA, who has an organization called Islah LA, right? So these are some grassroots organizations that are operating from a traditional Islam paradigm, right? So I would say, and there's more than this. I mean, the Mahroof Center in Milwaukee is doing fabulous work, right? In the poorest zip code in the state of Wisconsin, right? And that's led by organization with the African Americans, West Africans, along with Arab Americans, all pooling their resources and working together. So we have models of cooperation between Black and Arab, so-called immigrant and so-called indigenous in these cities. I want to lift that up, right? There are models that are striving to be prophetic, and I love what those brothers and those sisters are doing in these organizations. May Allah bless them and bless their families.
I mean, may Allah increase that work.
And Brother Ahmed, can I add to that very quickly?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. So, I do appreciate Imam Dawud, uplifting the work of these organizations. And I just want to add just a couple of things that sometimes the type of work, Brother Ahmed, that you'd like that you'd like the community to learn more about, that it's not always been the case that type of work has actually sort of taken place under the auspices, say, of an organization, right? A lot of times it can be just the presence of that very kind of charismatic leader or imam in a community. So, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, Imam Jamil Al-Amin in Atlanta. Because I was raised in Atlanta, and my parents have been there for decades, mashallah. And, way before Atlanta, Atlanta probably has upwards of 60 mosques at least. But, there was a time in Atlanta when you only had 2-3 masajid. You had the Al-Faruq Mosque in Midtown. You had the Atlanta Masjid of Al-Islam on the east side, and then you had in Southwest Atlanta, you had the community masjid of Imam Jamil Al-Amin. And that was, as Imam Dawud was speaking about Imam Siraj Wahaj, may Allah preserve him, Imam Jamil, who we know has been unjustly incarcerated since for the last 20 years, one of the things that he did in that community without having, funding from any kind of like national Muslim organization or anything of that sort, any kind of recognition, is that he and a group of Muslim families moved into that neighborhood, established a presence with masjid and a store and a school. And, there were all these remarkable stories, as Imam Dawud was saying, of people that were, kind of like toting guns and selling drugs, and how the brothers were cleaning up that community, and stories of people that were going from that type of lifestyle to kind of saying their shahada right there in the park where the Muslims would pray. We would often have our Eid prayer there. So I think it's important for us to understand that, alhamdulillah, today we actually have this work that's actually being done with some organizational clout behind it. But there are also these efforts that were sometimes unsung of different imams and urban communities. And I think we really need to look back and take stock of what it actually took to go out there and do that work. Regarding violent interrupters, their sister Amina Matthews, a few years back, a documentary, I believe, was made about her work as a violent interrupter. And I think that, again, to actually, and that to me is really the most prophetic in terms of community building, because it's easy for me to be a teacher in a classroom, but, to actually be able to go out there and engage with those different demographics in the community and actually get people to put down those guns and listen to the other side and even take their shahada, to me is just really amazing. MashaAllah.
Yeah, and just to mention Sister Amina Matthews, may Allah preserve her. She is she comes from a very notable family in the South Side of Chicago, to say the least. But I really suggest that you all go and look at that. Go and Google it, look up. It's called The Interrupters, as Ustad Zainab said, and it's just subhanallah the work that she's done along with her husband Sheikh Abdul Rashid and the Jama'ah there. I mean, Sister Amina, who's a pretty petite sister, will walk right in the middle of a conflict and get these big, like, so-called tough guys to like submit and listen to what she has to say. Of course, she is like with the four brothers standing behind her wearing red turbans and thobes. It's quite subhanAllah. I can't even put it into words, but
it must be the nur. It must be the nur just penetrates.
Yeah, the type of work in dawah that they've done in Southside Chicago, in one of the poorest zip codes in America, which is has a reputation of being a really tough place. Muslims are really like have made a difference there. And the sister who's not running a big nonprofit organization has been leading the charge in that. So thank you very much for lifting that up, Ustad Zainab.
That's brilliant. And what was consistent in both of your answers was whether it was an organization or individuals doing brilliant work. It's really folks getting in there, getting engaged to solve the issues that are found in those communities. And a lot of those issues are they can be traced to the system that was designed to oppress them. And when we're trying to address these issues, there are at least two battlegrounds. There's the battleground to dismantle the system of white supremacy, and then there's the struggle to help those who are battered and bruised by the system. Can each of you, maybe starting with Sheikha Zainab, comment on some of the practical work that you're doing, either yourselves and we also talked about some of the great work that's already been done. But if there's anything else you'd like to add on this subject, maybe Sheikha Zainab comment a little bit more on some of the curriculum you go over with your students at Taysir Seminary.
Absolutely. I want to underscore Brother Ahmed and Imam Dawud, and for all of us who've joined us, that my experience in Knoxville is not unique in terms of sort of this perception of the erasure of the African American Muslim voice and presence. It's not unique to this community. I mean, even when I visited Memphis, for example, which is Memphis with its history as the city where Dr. King was assassinated, and the fact that there's that motel where he was assassinated was actually turned into a civil rights museum and shrine. And Memphis kind of being home, much like Atlanta, to historic African-American Muslim communities that sort of began life as Nation of Islam communities and then transitioned to Sunni Islam. I remember visiting a masjid in Memphis some years back, and there was, when you go into the masjid, there's a museum documenting the history of the community and the elders. And it was just fascinating. I just remember thinking, I wish I could just stay here for hours and explore this history. But I remember an older sister lamenting to me that the young people don't want to come. They don't want to be involved in this. They don't want to, they're just not connected to this history. So I want, my viewers to understand it's not unique to where I am. It's just that, that what I'm seeing, and not just with the African-American Muslim community, but in general, sort of our youth being disconnected, feeling that this experience of being Muslim in this country, that it's not resonating with them sort of emotionally, say, the way it is with the experience of, say, my parents' generation. So that's really been something of concern to me, because I see it kind of happening on a local level, this kind of like detachment or disconnection, or this disconnect. And I've seen it happening on a national level. I remember being at a major convention some years back, and they had kind of a youth component to the program and saying, hey, where's the African-American youth representation? So this is just a concern of mine, raising African-American Muslim children, and trying to think about how to keep our youth engaged. So to your question, Brother Ahmed, in terms of what are some of the things I'm working on. So when I was in Atlanta, I was part of a project called the After Malcolm Project. And what's so interesting is that this was, initially it was really kind of conceived of as a way for for those of us who are kind of working on our graduate programs to kind of do a little bit of what is basically called public history, where we decided we would actually go out and start to interview elders in the African American Muslim community in Atlanta. And what's so interesting is that it actually, alhamdulillah, actually became part of it. Some of those efforts led to having a couple museum displays and a couple institutions across the metro area in Atlanta. There was a documentary that was made, in addition to the probably about 50 or 60 hours of oral history interviews that we captured. And I remember and working on that project, being a part of it and bringing it to Knoxville, and alhamdulillah getting a really positive response here from the community and from my students that this is possibly a way for us as Muslims, whatever background we come from, to really be able to engage with our own history, to kind of bring these narratives back, to learn from our elders, to kind of bridge that cross-generational divide. So I would highly recommend, for people who have some background in kind of interviewing techniques, this is something that our communities could look into, bringing together younger people and older people to learn from each other and capture and preserve those stories and have them there for posterity. So that's one of the things I want to suggest. It's called the After Malcolm Project, and some of our material has actually been archived at George Mason University.
This was done while you were a student at university, or this was done with volunteer work with some of the masajid over there?
So this project was really it was a collaboration of professors at a couple different universities in Atlanta, as well as graduate students, some undergrads, and stakeholders in the community, especially the leadership of Atlanta Masjid. They were very helpful. And the community members who really put their trust in us. They would let us show up with cameras and recorders and just sit down in their living rooms and talk. And we learn things about our elders, about ourselves, about Muslim history in this country. That was just really fascinating. When you get to sit down with a sister who said, yeah, I remember, seeing Malcolm going door to door with people in the community before he became famous. I mean, those are the kinds of stories that we got. It was really amazing, mashallah.
It was brilliant just hearing your response of all the different areas of the community coming together for that project. And that's something really to hopefully take inspiration from and try to do similar projects in our own capacity. Imam Dawud, would you like to add to this question?
I would add this very brief point that protests and marching, having rallies are good and at times needed. And I do believe that there are certain reforms that need to be taking place as far as public policy and laws. But the issue of the false ideology of white supremacy and the racism that accompanies it cannot be legislated nor adjudicated away, right? Legislation and adjudication cannot, by legislation, obviously laws, and adjudication means court rulings, cannot do away with this issue, because at the roots of it, we're talking about diseases of the heart. And diseases of the heart cannot be legislated away, nor can be proverbially whipped out of people by court rulings, right? It's simply not the case. And we're talking about, in America, we're talking about an over 4-century project which has seeped into the metaculture, cultural racism, right? That influences many things, right? So if laws would have solved the problem, then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act, anti-lynching laws, affirmative action, all of those laws would have solved the problem, or the court case of Loving versus Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage in 1970. I was born in the early 70s after this, but that would have solved the problem. So laws and court cases in themselves can't do it, which this goes back to something that Ustad Zainab was talking about. It relates to the issue of education. that helps to address cultural racism, right? But even beyond cultural racism, problems of thinking also come about or are rooted from diseased hearts. So we as American Muslims, and Malcolm pointed to this when he came back from his Hajj trip, he said that if white America embraced Islam or studied Islam, then perhaps it would solve the race problem in America, because he came across Caucasian people. He came across Turks and Bosnians and Albanians at Hajj, but he said that they didn't carry themselves the same way that white folks carry themselves here in America, right? So white supremacy is a mindset, is not about melanin content, right? So this is for a broader issue, a broader discussion. But what also can we model for the broader American society, not just educationally, but in our teachings, but how we embody what it means, as Dr. King says, to have the beloved community, where you have different ethnic groups and different racial groups who are with each other in school, who live next to each other, who do business with each other, and how that's modeled with love. That's, I think, the challenge that America has not really seen and manifested in a manifest, real, deep way in cities and townships all across America. And that's why I think that's probably the biggest thing that Muslims can contribute to the American society, in my opinion. But Allah knows best.
Yeah. You know, just to comment on that, as you're talking about education and for us to educate ourselves on these projects and the educational projects that Ustadh Zainab mentioned, I just want to highlight something that Imam Jafar taught us, and it goes against what the educational system in this country, I think, has been reduced to, and that's a lot of people just trying to learn things to get a grade. No, educating in its purest form is meant to change our lives, and it's not an intellectual exercise, it's a spiritual exercise as well. And so I want to encourage everybody listening to, including myself, to view education in that way. Also, for the viewers, as you're watching this on YouTube, please put your questions in the chat box there. They will get forwarded to us. One that I think weaves in very beautifully with where we are in the discussion is, you've mentioned a lot of work being done in the inner cities by Muslims who are in the inner cities, but we are, realistically speaking, we're a suburban masjid, and there's a lot of questions of how can those in a suburban masjid get involved in social justice movements or get involved in social change. What are some things you've seen in such communities? So we are a suburban masjid, but Albany is just a 10-minute drive away. So we have that, both settings pretty easily accessible.
Inshallah, I'd like to say something, if I may. You know, one of the things that's so interesting about the community here, with Knoxville being a much smaller city than Atlanta, even though most of the Muslims tend to live in the suburbs, the masjid is actually in the downtown area, which is closer to the historically African-American neighborhoods in Knoxville. And I was really happy to see when the pandemic first hit, one of the things the masjid actually did, and if you think about it, resources, this is a time when resources are really kind of constrained, but the masjid was very intentional in actually hiring someone to be kind of a case manager. So, and one of the things that I'm finding is that for our masajid, this is actually a fairly, especially maybe for masajid that actually are more suburban, this idea that we should actually have a social worker or a case manager. So someone was actually brought on board to do social work. And one of the things the masjid actually did was to make sure that community members had access to information, public health information, that they had access to someone to help them to actually fill out forms to access certain resources, including those stimulus payments. The masjid was actually had a program, and again, we can all be involved in this, where there are people who are donating money, there are others who are picking things up and delivering them, where you could actually get packages of like fresh groceries delivered to families. So, there are ways that we can come together and contribute, regardless of our geographical location. Imam Dawud and I were discussing this the other day, so maybe he can say more about this. Dr. Bagby has made Dr. Ihsan Bagby, who worked on ISNA's mosque project and making mosques more accessible, spoke the other day about how mu'akhah would look in this time. That was the model where the Prophet ﷺ brought together different segments of the community, the Muhajirin and the Ansar, and how they supported each other. And how would that look today? And he had some suggestions for how suburban masajid could actually kind of partner with mosques, masajid in inner city communities. But I'll let Imam Dawud speak more to that.
Well, I think one of the keys is that when we're talking about getting involved in social justice movements is communication. And I would like to say something in particular to perhaps some of the younger people who've been concerned more so about recent events and the whole Black Lives Matter push. I would say that before going to the streets and trying to engage a movement that is outside of our community for police accountability or for the respect of Black lives, to start with developing relationships and communicating with your own African-American brothers and sisters in Islam, right? To actually go to the areas and to the masajid of where they're praying at and to develop those relationships. Just go there and pray and start talking with people and not going in a type of a paternalistic attitude as if you're doing them a favor. No, we're trying to cultivate brotherhood and sisterhood. And from that, organically, I believe that people in suburban masajid would actually get a better understanding of what actually is going on in the community and who's working on what, instead of trying to jump over your brothers and sisters in Islam to go to embrace some movement in which some of it is promoting things that we would consider to be laudatory, and then some of it also we would find to be highly problematic, that actually clearly contravene Islamic morality according to the Quran and Sunnah, and actually advocating for certain things that are from the munkarat, that are prohibited for us to advocate in favor of. In the city of Detroit, if I can just mention an example, there's an organization called Dream of Detroit. And Dream of Detroit is an organization that was set up, community development. It's set up by an immigrant from Pakistan, a Pakistani American who's a medical doctor, and also an African-American community organizer who actually used to work for Iman, actually in Chicago, before he moved to the city of Detroit. And this was a project that linked together a masjid in the city of Detroit called the Muslim Center with South Asian American Muslims from a suburb, in which there was a linkage, right? And there are board members that are basically that are mixed between urban and suburban, and there's like a link of communication in which this type of work is going on. So the important thing is relationships, and sincere relationships. And if we are trying to cultivate this brotherhood and sisterhood, as Ustad Zainab mentioned, with sincerity, like the Muhajirin and Ansar came together for the sake of Allah with sincerity, then Allah Azza wa Jal, with his permission and his wisdom, I believe he will give us a fat, or give us an opening that we can, work together better on these issues for his sake, Azza wa Jal.
Yeah, and just want to underline, Imam Dawud, as you mentioned, going into the communities at the masajid that are predominantly perhaps Black American Muslims, and you said to learn from their struggles. This is a really important point important time to underline the strengths that we mentioned at the very beginning, the first question. When you actually go into those masajid and sit with them, you will see those strengths on first display. You might go there thinking that you're going to learn about their struggles, but wallahi, you will learn about their strengths and you will leave with a stronger sense of iman. I know this from experience. And Imam Dawud and Ustadha Zainab, you mentioned a few projects that either you were directly involved in or you know of. Can you speak to the healing effects of these projects? You mentioned some modern day mu'akha projects and so forth, or perhaps the project that you did in Atlanta, the After Malcolm project. Can you speak to how that's the effect that's had on your iman, or the effect that's had on the iman of those who've engaged in those projects?
I think that for me, in working on that project, Brother Ahmed, initially there's sort of this, there's this, the impetus might be more intellectual or more academic. But, one of the things I always say to my students is that even, when you study history, it's not just what you kind of find on the pages of the textbook. That you can't look at history as kind of just a dry listing of one fact, after another. That, as Muslims, that we are looking at history through this devotional lens. I mean, that's at the heart of why we preserve and document the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? It's to actually understand that there is a wisdom behind why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed us in the context that he did, and to be able to understand that. And I think you can actually glean a lot of that through our history. When I think, for example, of the millions of West Africans, and many of them were Muslims, who were brought to these shores, and families were torn apart, people were enslaved, they had their names and identities taken from them. But surely those people must have made dua, right? I mean, this is what we really need to think about, that, as we kind of battle Islamophobia and we deal with the anxiety around COVID-19, and we look at what's happening in our country today, and we inshallah start to kind of reflect upon how we can address these issues and the role that we necessarily have to play in issues of racial and social justice. I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed a Muslim community in this country, even from before its inception. What does that mean, right? How does that translate to today's context, right? Is our presence today not the result possibly of du'a that were made centuries ago? We have to look at it in those terms. And as far as what I find healing in, Brother Ahmed, as Imam Dawud said, that there is something that Muslims, that our community, I think, can uniquely offer. And that's to be able to understand that even if in the realm of the dunya that we don't achieve the level of justice that we want, that there is still the akhirah, right? That the Muslim never despairs. We don't basically consign all efficacy and hopes to this dunya, right? That we have to keep our focus oriented on the akhirah. This is what we can share with our community, with our neighbors, within our families, inshallah ta'ala.
Imam Dawud?
Just very briefly, there's healing in the struggle. And I say this to the brothers and sisters who are watching this, that we have to be careful of just thinking or looking at our lives as a goal of middle-class respectability or being comfortable, right? And if we're talking about building community and healing hearts, that takes struggle and that takes sacrifice, right? That means that going out of your way sometimes, and maybe losing a few hours of sleep and driving some miles away from where you normally would drive, and maybe being in some uncomfortable positions or some situations where you actually feel vulnerable. But doing some work, doing some projects with your brothers and sisters in Islam and in humanity, and being involved in just those visceral reactions of swaying together and smiling, or sharing some of your same common joys and anxieties, that struggle in of itself, there's a type of healing in that struggle. And we always refer back to the best generation of the Sahaba, and we keep on referring back to Muhajirin and Ansar. These are men and women who struggle with each other for the sake of Allah, to the point where Ithar was their starting point, that they were altruistic, where they preferred their brother and their sister over themselves, right? But this is part of this getting together and part of the struggle. So maybe that's not a specific example, but that's what's on my heart right now to share.
SubhanAllah, but that sets things really nicely for this question that just came through the chat box, because there are those who don't care too much about the middle class respectability. They want to get involved in these social justice movements, and they're asking, sincere question is, what kind of professionals would be at the forefront of such projects? Can you give us some examples of some areas that young people can aspire to fill in terms of occupations?
Now, I don't know that there would be such a thing as a social justice professional, to be honest. I mean, I really appreciate the question. Thank you so much. But to me, it's not so much the profession you're in as the requirement is the willingness to, as Imam Dawud said, kind of deal with the inconveniences and the trouble, and just sort of stepping outside of that comfort zone, right? And for me, the first condition is to care. And then once I think you have that foundation of sincerely caring, obviously there are some professions that would be helpful. There's some background knowledge and expertise that would be helpful. But if you look at the people that are actually involved in this work, they may never have actually trained for this on a professional level, but look at the openings that Allah Ta'ala has given them because of their sincerity.
And let me just maybe follow up with this. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about defunding the police and maybe channeling that money into increased funding for social workers and mental health clinicians. Do you think we're at a crucial juncture in history where maybe we should be encouraging our children, hey, this is a place where we can make a big change, and there's about to be this is a pivotal point in our history, and this is where we should be telling some of our kids to study, as long as that's something in their hearts?
Alhamdulillah. I think that being a social worker is a noble profession. I would say, however, in regards to this particular profession and some others in relation to academia, in terms of the Department of Social Work or sociology in general, that it's very important that, number one, whoever is going to this, and we should be get some sort of basic education in usul din, in our tradition, and that we stay plugged in and have spiritual mentors, right? Because within that particular work, with the particular discipline, and when you go into the university in some of these departments, that there's a certain epistemology that or a basis that people have taught of how to judge right and wrong, or to how to view the world based upon a particular system of how truth is understood and processed. And there needs to be some foundational Islamic knowledge to be able to sift through some of those things. Otherwise, it could take one into literally into kufr, and I'm not exaggerating, right? If we're not careful. So that's my first part. Let me go back to the first part, and I'm going backwards. Regarding defund the police, I think that there could have been some better language that could have been used for this actual project of defund the police, because when people hear defund the police or abolish the police, they freak out. Yep. But there are certain aspects of policing in America that I think does need to be defunded. There needs to be defunding of the police when major police departments are being trained in so-called riot control and in policing from a particular foreign military. That should be defunded, right? And I think you all probably know which foreign military I'm talking about. They're an occupational army. All right, so that's one thing. The usage of military equipment and also surveillance technology that usurps people's privacy rights and actually gives a high amount of false positives. There was an issue in Detroit where this 42-year-old African-American man was falsely identified and arrested for this facial recognition technology. We also think those things should be defunded as well. The police unions need to be broken up, because this is one thing in which police aren't being held accountable and being properly disciplined or let go from police departments. And I was just on a call yesterday with the Detroit Police Commission for their, it was a Zoom call. There was a police officer who just got a promotion who has had 10 citizen complaints of Detroit of abuse. And this person just got promoted. How they get to keep their job? Because the police union, right? So there are certain things that we should seek to defund and to abolish. It doesn't mean not having any police forces at all. And I think that Muslims should get behind these sorts of defunding and get rid of some of these things because they've proven to support law enforcement abuse and to impede law enforcement accountability.
SubhanAllah. So, alhamdulillah, we've been giving this platform where we can actually talk about these issues here. But one of the questions comes in is racial injustice is prevalent across the globe. How do we share the lessons that we learn with our communities, particularly those, if we're in a community that doesn't give us a voice, how can we start trying making inroads in our community so that we can bring these discussions to the table and try to do things? So alhamdulillah, we're able to have these discussions, but unfortunately not every community is at the level where they're having those discussions, nor do they see the importance of them. For those people that can see that this is something that needs to happen, how can they bring it to their boards? How can they bring it to their leadership? What have you seen work in your experience?
It really depends, Brother Ahmed, and thank you to the person who asked the question. In terms of there are several considerations. First of all, you have to look at, I think, the demographic makeup of your community. I think, as much as many of us are very eager to kind of get out there and kind of get to work, I think that there's a certain amount of kind of intra-community communication that we need to be able to foster, right? So we at least understand that while I think it's helpful to have individuals within the community who want to be involved, right? That ideally they would be supported by a larger vision there. And in terms of what form that takes, I mean, it could be to where we begin to lobby to make the masajid boards more diverse and more representative. I mean, that's one place to start, right? Another thing too is that for communities that feel that we don't really have a stake in these issues, I think that a good place to begin is just to remind all of us that whatever our background is, that I think we all share a common cause and devotion to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, that kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas. I mean, I don't know too many Muslims that are going to disavow that. Hopefully they would not, right? Again, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas. Why? Ta'muruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhawna 'anil munkar. So, I mean, if we have been told that it's because you enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, wa tu'minuna billah, that gives us, I think, a common starting point. What does it actually mean to be this ummah? That's an ummah of balance and moderation. Does it mean that and again, I'm speaking to myself first of all here, does it mean that we're all kind of very comfortably ensconced in the suburbs saying, well, it doesn't really immediately, it affects us whether we realize it or not. And, I would also say that if we are in this country and at some point someone immigrated to this country, there is a debt that we owe to the African-American community in terms of the Black liberation struggle and what that paved the way for historically for transnational immigrant Muslims. But I think that we have to approach this issue because it can be easy to kind of get in there and be frustrated and to kind of like antagonize. And we don't want to do that, right? To say that this is an issue of just appealing to our better angels, so to speak, right? In other words, we approach people from the standpoint of husn al-dhan, thinking well of people, giving nasiha, looking at what educational opportunities we can make available for our community. There's the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, for example. They do training programs for masajid and organizations. There's also just on the level, I think, of how we interact with each other, right? That if we're at least trying to make sure that there is more meaningful interaction, I think, across the diverse components of our community, this is very helpful, I think. And this will, inshallah, allow us to actually have the confidence to go out there and to have a stronger voice.
Yeah. To that point about increased diversity and representation and more voices at the table, I think you and Dr. Tamara Gray, Stella Zainab, have done great work in that regard. And we might, and I just want to recommend to folks, I think there's a couple of podcasts on the Al-Madina Institute website along those lines that people can tune into. But going back to the question, is there anything you'd like to add, Imam Dawud?
I don't have anything else to add. I would just say that I agree with all of what Ustad Zainab said, and just maybe double click or just put an exclamation point behind the issue of board representation. I think that's very important. And it's not an issue of tokenism. And we're going to clarify that too, that diversity and having different people with different points of view from different backgrounds only strengthens how the community or broadens the community's perception of how it sees things. So I would never say that diversity, that to add on different people of different ethnic groups or races, and also different socioeconomic backgrounds, that does nothing but strengthen the community. It's not an issue of tokenism or just checking off a box.
Absolutely, Imam Dawud, absolutely. Maybe you have time for one or maybe two more questions. If folks have any questions on their mind, please put them in the YouTube chat. Here's one question that I think is important to cover. For those that maybe begin to get involved, there are those who are concerned about how vulnerable we are as a Muslim community, and they want some tips on how to, if they want to begin to engage in these struggles, how can they do so in a safe and secure way? Perhaps Imam Dawud, you can take this one.
Our elders have a saying that there is no safety in the margins. There's no safety in the margins. So if you see the need that there needs to be something that needs to be done, that it is good or wise, again, to go to people who've been involved in the work and ask how you can get involved and how you can support and take their lead. But don't fool yourself and think that if you see something that needs to be done and you're going to keep yourself safe and secure by not getting involved and thinking that you're just going to ignore it, that actually is a false sense of security, a false sense of safety. There isn't safety in the margins.
And I think a lot of the safety and security questions, I've heard this multiple times, they have come from sisters. So maybe Ustadha Zainab, anything you'd like to add to this question?
Yes, thank you, Brother Ahmed. I'm very sympathetic to the concerns of our sisters. I mean, one of the things that had occurred to me when people asked me, well, are you going to go to the demonstrations, is that, as a single parent, sometimes, there are certain considerations that you have, just practical things in terms of your health and that type of thing. I'm not quite clear in terms of where the questioner is coming from in terms of, is she saying, is it healthy to go out there and protest, or just more on the level of, is it appropriate for Muslim women? That I'm not sure. But, I do tell sisters that, look, this idea of that my haya or modesty would kind of like preclude me from being involved or having a voice. I remember that our ultimately our haya is owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as opposed to having this kind of sense of, okay, having silence around people, especially when we can use our voices to speak up and to speak out. I always advise sisters, again, not knowing the context of the question, I always advise sisters to of course, be careful and to be prudent. But we also have to understand this, again, going back to the history, right? When we look at the civil rights struggle, right, you had those leaders that were in the forefront, right? Like Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and so many others. But we need to understand the role that the women played. And it wasn't, and these were women that had to have the ability to kind of step outside of what possibly may have been a very kind of like comfortable domestic sphere, and to realize that there was a lot of work there that they could actually do, that whether it was sort of front and center, people like Diane Nash, or it was people who were kind of like more behind the scenes. So what I would say to sisters is, yes, I understand where you're coming from, but whether we look at women in the civil rights struggle, or we go back even further and look at those pioneering Muslim women during the early days of Islam, right? Sometimes you kind of have to make a choice between, okay, this is what is comfortable and this is what's safe, but this is what actually needs to be done, right? And again, I am giving you a very sort of vivid example on purpose. I mean, if Amara Nusayba bint Ka'b had said, I'm just going to stay home and be comfortable, then you would not have had that valiant woman at Uhud defending the Prophet ﷺ. So we need to think about that. So again, be sensible, be prudent. But I agree with Imam Dawud. I don't know that being kind of like sort of staying in that space of convenience and comfort is going to lead to the kind of change that we need to see necessarily.
SubhanAllah. And I think it's fitting to maybe conclude with this last question, because we do want to see change within our own communities. And this goes back to the topic we just discussed. How do we deal with the racism and prejudice in our own communities in masajid? And what advice do you have for groups, maybe Black Muslims or sisters, that are perhaps discouraged or feel pushed away from the communities? How can they rise above that? And what advice do we have for those groups?
Imam Dawud?
Bismillah.
Well, the Imam Dawud talked about self-care. There was, mashallah, he got me thinking about this the other day, that there was a discussion where his emphasis was on self-care. So for the person who asked that question, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Again, as Muslims, as people of faith, that we don't want to succumb to despair, right? We might get upset with our fellow brothers and sisters. You might get frustrated, but it's really important that I think that we not succumb to despair, or sort of any kind of disparaging tone of, I'm tired of, I actually heard this the other day, I'm tired of listening to these immigrant uncles telling me what to do. That this is not, as Muslims, that we can do better than this, right? Because we have the best example before us in the Prophet ﷺ. To continue to, I think, to stand up and to push back, but to also do that in a way that's wise and skillful and balanced, I think, is very important, while also focusing on self-care. But my message for our transnational or immigrant Muslims would also be that we have to be able to hold that mirror up to ourselves as well, because there is a lot that's going on within our community that we absolutely must address. I mean, the fact that people are still saying, even in this time, that they're still dealing with people using terms like abid, for example, to discuss African Americans, that we have this sort of colorism in our communities, that kids in Islamic school, that children, African American children in Islamic schools are coming home and saying that they are actually people using racial slurs. I mean, we can't tolerate this. And, or those stories that you hear all the time about, people not having, African American Muslims not having their salam returned to them, say in public, and they give salam to someone who might be Arab or South Asian. Again, I think that there's this response we tend to give of just, be patient, things will change. Sabr should not be used as kind of a way to sort of suppress and silence people, right? Sabr patience is the disposition of the believer, but it's also patience that's accompanied by wise and skillful action as well.
SubhanAllah. Imam Dawud?
Two pieces of advice, besides agreeing 100% with what Ustadh Zainab said, is one is that find for yourself, if you don't have it, find for yourself some affirming sohbah, meaning some spaces that you can be involved in. There's some company companionship of fellow brothers and sisters in Islam where you feel emotionally safe, right? And I can't stress that, because there's been times in my life in certain marakas, certain masajid, I didn't feel emotionally safe being in those places, to be quite frank. So try to find some spaces where you feel emotionally safe. Beyond that, I would say reflect on the story of Nabi Yunus alayhi salam. People aren't going to answer the call necessarily when you want them to, right? You keep on gently giving advice where you can, as long as it's not an overly hostile scenario or hostile places, but you keep on giving advice. And we can't determine when people are going to answer the call. So just reflect on the story of Nabi Yunus alayhi salam. Actually, I spoke about this, I think, last Friday, in Salatul Jummah, I believe it was last Friday. Everything's a blur because of all these Zooms and things, but let's reflect on it was last Saturday to a group in the UK. Reflect on the story of Nabi Yunus alayhi salam. People don't always answer the call when we want them to, and when we turn our back and retreat, we may come back and find that they've answered the call and implementing that which we call them towards. So that's something for us to keep in mind.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. Jazakallah khair for that answer. That actually takes up all our time for today's discussion. And what I did want to plug in was, for that last question, we do have a discussion that's going to come up. The date is to be decided for dealing with racism within ourselves. And we also had a talk, as we said at the beginning, towards a prophetic and vibrant community. At this time, I wanted to invite Ustadha Zainab to close the session off with dua. Tfaddali, Ustadha Zainab.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام وإليك يعود السلام، فحينا يا ربنا بالسلام وأدخلنا الجنة دار السلام. تباركت وتعاليت يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to confer peace upon us, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fill our hearts with peace, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to exemplify that peace within our households, our families, our communities, and beyond. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us to facilitate for us to see truth as truth and to always follow it, and to see falsehood as falsehood and to always shun and avoid it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify and to elevate our intention, our niyat. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our actions. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for all of our sins, mistakes, and shortcomings, those of which we are aware and unaware. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to unite the hearts of the Muslim community and all of the Muslim ummah on what is good, what is khair, what is beneficial. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove from our hearts the diseases of arrogance and prejudice and racism and envy and looking down on any fellow Muslim and human being. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to fulfill the objective and the reason for why Allah ta'ala placed us in this context in the United States in the 21st century. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give our community the strength for us to be able to raise our voices in support of those who are oppressed, all the mustada'afin fil ard, in every place. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring justice and healing to this country and beyond. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate this ibtila of COVID-19, this test of COVID-19, and to confer healing and safety and security on all of us, and to have mercy on those who've passed on, and to reward those who are on the front lines dealing with this pandemic. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate the suffering of the oppressed in every place on this earth. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow, to continue to bless us with the gift of Iman in the hearts of every succeeding generation. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give all of us husn al-khitam, the best of endings. where the words on our tongue are exemplify and reflect what's in our hearts, the word of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow all of us on Yawm al-Qiyamah to receive his shade and his mercy on the day when there is no shade except from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to be part of that ummah that will make our beloved Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam happy when he sees us. آمين يا رب العالمين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. إلى شرف النبي وآله. الفاتحة. آمين.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for closing the session off for us. Ustadha Zainab, thank you so much for joining us. Imam Dawud. Everybody, please have a blessed evening. May Allah bless this day of Jum'ah for us. And may Allah join us together, inshallah, for future discussions. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yeah,